Today, America is the strongest country in the world, but this wasn't inevitable. While people like to talk about the risk of the Civil War permanently dividing the Union, and I have a video about that, a comparable time of crisis occurred in the late 1700s after the 13 colonies first got their independence from Britain. Back then, the nascent Union was seriously vulnerable. The federal government, ordered not by the Constitution but by the weak Articles of Confederation, had very little power. America was basically as united then as the European Union is today. In 1786, for example, anti-tax rebels under the leadership of Daniel Shays rose up to topple the Massachusetts government. While they were defeated, this contributed to a sense across the nation that something needed to be done. Shays' rebellion, together with Congress's inability to raise taxes and the fear of reconquest by Britain, drove the states to gather together and draft the U.S. Constitution, truly uniting the country at last, at least for a little bit. But this wasn't inevitable. What if the states failed to reach an agreement? What if America never united? Well, this is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to read the extended timeline, check it out on my Patreon. Okay, let's rewind back to the late 1700s. There was a lot of pressure back then for the American states to come together into a stronger union, but the many republics also had plenty of competing interests that drove them apart. If a different slate of delegates traveled to Philadelphia in 1787, or if Rhode Island actually sent anybody at all, the states might not have found a suitable compromise. And that's where history changes. With the states unable to reach an agreement, the Constitutional Convention is a failure. The delegates return home, but the crisis just continues to grow. War debts continue to burden states, and when they impose taxes, the people rise up in revolt. In 1789, the states again send delegates to a convention, this time in New York. And again, they're unable to reach a compromise, with the Southerners walking away when the convention threatens to crack down on slavery. With the failure of Philadelphia and now the New York Convention, many states view the Articles of Confederation as irredeemable. In 1790, skirmishes erupt between the militias of New York and New England over whether Vermont, claimed by New York, should be admitted into the Confederation. Meanwhile, tax revolts erupt in Pennsylvania with a mob descending on the city of brotherly love. Congress is unable to raise funds for a national army. Instead, George Washington, the hero of the Revolutionary War, leads a voluntary force that barely manages to liberate Philadelphia. To the north, the New England states forge a joint army to confront New York, which invades Connecticut. The armies clash and New York wins, taking control of New Haven, Hartford, and putting into power a friendly government. Next, New York marches on Boston. With the Union splitting apart into civil war, many in Congress call for George Washington to seize power as a dictator and invade New York. But Washington refuses. Many, including him, still view monarchy as more dangerous than disorder. Instead, Washington just publishes a call for the states to settle their differences peacefully. Obviously, they don't. With New York threatening to crush New England, Pennsylvania and New Jersey join forces, rallying an army and march against New York City. They capture the city. With the New York forces stuck sieging Boston, Governor George Clinton of New York has no option but the negotiation table. New York agrees to compensate the other states for losses and abandon claims to Vermont. But more importantly, the states agree to dissolve their union and peacefully go their separate ways. The Articles of Confederation are dead. The Union is dead before it even really began. Over the 1790s, the states continue to jostle, skirmishing over disputed territory. Some settlers even forge new states entirely. All sorts of geopolitical mischief and skullduggery occur in this period. Speaking of bad behavior and deception, have you ever noticed how many scam texts and calls we're getting these days? This one that I got just keeps insisting I'm somebody named Lauren who owes $400 for a dermatology visit. You probably get messages like this all the time too, and it's because big companies just don't keep our data safe anymore. I mean, just look at AT&T. Someone snatched 70 million of their users' social security numbers. Even if you don't use AT&T, it can happen to you next. But Aura, the sponsor of today's video, is just the way to keep yourself safe. Aura will alert you if they find out that your number or any other sensitive info has been compromised. They've got fast fraud alerts if anyone tries to use that data to access your bank accounts, which happens a lot actually. But that's not it. You can get access to transaction monitoring, a VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, and identity theft insurance. You can even get an AI-powered call assistant that will pick up unknown calls for you. And for anyone else getting fake dermatology text messages, Aura can filter those out as well. All of this in one app at one affordable price. In this day and age, you just can't leave yourself exposed and vulnerable. Don't risk it. Check out Aura at aura.com/whatwhyhow and try your first 2 weeks for free. And if you don't like typing, I put the link below. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you, my audience, for listening. Okay, let's get back to the 1790s. Where was I? Okay. Pennsylvania and New York partition New Jersey, Maryland and Delaware unify to ward off their neighbors, and Aaron Burr proclaims himself consul of the Northwestern Republic before losing a duel. Meanwhile, Britain begins to restore its influence over the colonies, crafting an alliance with New England. While the American Revolution appears to have ended in disunion, revolution still explodes in France. War soon erupts between France and its enemies, with the war spreading to the coasts of America. Britain abducts sailors from Virginia and the southern colonies, while French pirates ransack American merchants on their way to Britain. Skirmishes also erupt in the Midwest between ambitious British expeditions and American settlers. In 1810, Virginia and Pennsylvania lead the Middle States into war against Britain. New England and New York side with Britain, sparking war again between the republics. Despite patriotic fervor, the war goes pretty horribly for the Middle States. Northern troops overwhelm Pennsylvanian defenses and sack Philadelphia, stealing the Liberty Bell and marching on Richmond. Most horrifying of all, British troops free and arm slaves as they go, threatening to trigger a huge slave revolution. But while the Northern Front goes horribly, the Southern Front goes fantastically. American forces under the command of the ambitious General Andrew Jackson conquer Florida from pro-British Spain, then march west to New Orleans. They siege it for some time, then capture it at last in the name of the Allied States. Louisiana is free. But neither Britain or Virginia hear of this victory before General James Monroe of Virginia surrenders to British troops. Britain imposes humiliating conditions on the American republics, basically making them tributaries of the British Empire again in 1814. When General Jackson hears of this, he leads his army of veterans, ruffians, and settlers up the Mississippi and back to Richmond. Following in the footsteps of Napoleon, Jackson turns his troops against the government, toppling Governor Monroe in a coup. His soldiers, raising their weapons, proclaim him the new Consul of America. Over the next years, Jackson does not rest. He leads his army back and forth up the coast, dragging everything from Baton Rouge to Baltimore into his new republic. But with the real Napoleon dragged out of Europe by Britain, the British Empire is free to fill Philadelphia with redcoats. So Jackson holds off from attacking the northern states. Andrew Jackson is a clever dictator. He grants greater civil rights to white men without property and sets them against the planter elites, then positions himself as a great compromiser between them. Over the 1820s, Jackson directs the American army on brutal campaigns to destroy and deport Native American societies. In their place, planters build vast slave plantations. Along the Mississippi, conquered by Jackson, the consul organizes new states. He also competes with Britain for the northwestern states as well. But peace in America is fragile. In the early 1830s, Jackson's rule begins to buckle thanks to Southern resistance to his high tariff on goods. Planters want to sell cotton to Britain. This crisis escalates. When South Carolina proclaims it has nullified Jackson's tariff in 1832, Jackson marches his army and topples South Carolina's government. But this just triggers wider rebellion against his rule. Seeing Jackson's empire about to collapse, the northern states rally an army, secure British support, and march against the South. Opportunists like General Winfield Scott betray Jackson and join the invasion, which surrounds Jackson in Charlotte, North Carolina. Unwilling to be humiliated like Napoleon, Jackson goes down fighting. The Consul of America is dead. After Jackson's death, Britain oversees the division of his empire into easily controllable states. America is once again split apart. Over the rest of the 1830s and 1840s, American settlers continued to expand westward, slowly wiping up native resistance and occasionally butting elbows. Their economies are mostly twisted, though, to serve British commercial interests. Northern industry is stamped out in exchange for producing raw materials, while southern states are forced, sometimes at gunpoint, to reform slavery into indentured servitude. America is basically part of the British Empire in all but name. But British influence over America's politics and economy enrages many, raising temperatures over and over. In 1848, as revolutions erupt across Europe, the American pot boils over. Americans rise up again in a second American Revolution against Britain. Across the continent, patriots attack British troops, tar and feather loyalists, and throw out pro-British governors. But soon after, the counter-revolution begins. Planter elites in Virginia elbow out radical patriots, while in New York and Boston, merchant dynasties hijack the revolutions. These new governments make deals with Britain. But violence does continue in the South, where indentured servants rebel against plantation elites that have dragged their feet on promised freedoms. White militias ultimately put down the revolutions violently, while governments adopt radical policies to cement their supremacy. Revolution isn't just limited to Europe and America, it erupts in Mexico too, where the reigning emperor is overthrown. Not only that, but the many American settlers of California and Texas declare independence, organizing new republics of their own. In the second half of the 1800s, two major trends guide American history: industrialization and nationalism. With British control limited by the 1848 revolutions, the American republics sponsor the rise of new industrial magnates. New railroads tie the republics closer and closer together. But the American states are far from matching the industrial power of Britain, which continues to hold huge economic influence over the republics. In 1855, the Commonwealth of Louisiana, the largest American republic, collapses into civil war over slavery. This allows the ambitious republics of the eastern seaboard the opportunity for expansion. Virginia gobbles up Kentucky, Carolina reunites with Tennessee, and Georgian troops march to the Mississippi, where they shake hands with expansionist Texas, led by Consul Samuel Houston. The scramble for Louisiana reawakens the nationalist spirit of the American republics, with patriots calling for reunification, preferably by diplomacy, but by rifle and bayonet if necessary. Over the 1860s and 1870s, the republics attack each other again and again in several attempted wars of conquest. Britain attempts to play kingmaker with mixed results. It sells guns to Pennsylvania, only to have that republic partitioned by its stronger neighbors. Meanwhile, Consul Samuel Houston Jr. of Texas wrestles Georgia into the new Southern Republic without much contest. In the West, the Mormons secede from California using gifted Gatling guns from Texas. The republics of the Great Lakes, meanwhile, forge a new confederacy. While its sister republics feud, New England, allied with Old England, sends its sailors across the world. When European powers plant colonies in Africa, New England does so too, earning some valuable turf in West Africa. Colonial skirmishes in Africa finally bring Europe into a major war in 1905. On the one side is Britain and France, and on the other are the triple powers of Germany, Austria, and Russia. Each American republic hopes the Great War is the prophesied moment of reunification, and that they'll be the ones to do it. They plunge headstrong into war. Betraying their neighbors over petty territorial squabbles, the continent splits in two, between a pro-German faction led by New York, Texas, and Carolina, and a pro-British faction led by Virginia, the Northwest, New England, and California. Soldiers march proudly into war, only to be met by the horrors of modern technology. Soon, trenches scar the continent, with a generation of Americans losing their lives for inches of land. Artillery bombardment reduces cities on the front line, like Philadelphia, New Haven, and St. Louis, to smoldering rubble. Great suffering passes before fighting finally comes to a pause in 1918. While the war has no victors, some republics have land gains to show for their horrible losses. New York, led for a generation by the populist Consul Theodore Roosevelt, has accomplished its revanchist aims. It annexes Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, and the Delmarva Peninsula. To the south, Texas puts puppets in charge of the newly independent states of Kentucky, South Virginia, and Southern Illinois, aka New Egypt, forging an axis with Osage and Carolina. But these republics all face the threat of African secessionism and more radical ideologies. Stuck between the ascendant powers of New York and Texas are the Northwest Confederacy, whose humiliated government faces repeated revolt from workers demanding reform, and Virginia, which has lost its economic glory and is now practically a failed state. To the north is the Rump Federation of New England, whose radical Catholics call for radical policies. And of course, there's the Republic of Canada, once a key spoke in the wheel of the British Empire, now has its own path. To the east, Quebec is independent too. America in the 1920s is not a hopeful place. The scars of the Great War run deep, but the next generation of leaders, many of them radical ideologues, believe a redo could reunite America under their domination. Among these bloodthirsty psychopaths is none other than a man by the name of Jacob Featherstone. But even then, many in the American republics have hope for a peaceful future, a prosperous future, a democratic future, one where the many republics may even be molded back together into the United States of America. But you know what, this video is getting a little bit long. What do you think will happen next? Will America unify at last, and who will unify it? If you want to see my extended history to the present day, you can find that on my Patreon for just $1 a month, thanks to those who already support the channel. User SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, Caliber, Lehan, Whale, Goblin Stack, Lily, 7-Zip, Sean, Lars, Vantachromia, Jared, Omega, Quincy, Diamond Z, Dionosio, Wheatless, Amir, Benjamin, The Mysterious Doe, Basit, Mimo Taquito, Lord Dan, Samab, Tryhard, Dr. Cruiser, Dreher, and Channel 101 Productions. Thanks and adios.